powerful gun. So they use the same caliber, the 88mm, the size of the hole at the end of the barrel, but they make that gun a lot longer with a much bigger projectile case to go inside it, and hence the L71. It's a much longer barrel. Originally behind it all, again, it was a flat gun, but they changed the size of the case. They make the case slightly stubbier so it can be fitted inside a vehicle, but slightly wider so it can carry the same amount of propellant. So when this is being fitted, they've already put it on an improvised chassis, something called the Hornice, which was basically a Panzer IV, Panzer III chassis combined. And they use that as an open-topped, as a tank killer. Basically that sort of magnificently powerful gun on an open-top chassis. So it's already being used in the anti-tank gun role. They put it on this vehicle that they then call Ferdinand. Ferdinand after, of course, Ferdinand Porsche. And it becomes a tremendously powerful tank-killing weapon. The problem you've got, though, is even though they've got that casement on it to give plenty of room inside, you've got two loaders, by the way, inside there because the rounds are so big. So they up the specification for the armour. You end up with 20 centimetres, so 200mm of armour on the front of this vehicle, very thick armour protection. But that drivetrain and also the suspension system that Porsche has come up with is vulnerable. And the issue there is because his engines don't really work to start with, so they end up getting the reliable HL 120 engines. They were the engines that powered the Panzer III and the Panzer IV. They get two of those engines, squeeze them in the tank. They actually run electric generators, which then take the power to the rear of the vehicle where the drive sprockets are, and that's where you've got the electric motors. Now, it's air-cooled engines, and if you actually look at photographs of the engine decks, everything is tightly packed inside the space. Originally, all of that was going to be at the back of the tank, but once they have to reconfigure to make this a Panzerjäger, you've got two crew members in the front, they put the engine compartment in the middle, and the rear is the fighting compartment. But even there, they have to close off the two areas for the electric motors to power the drives at the back. So it's a very, very tight fit in there, even though it looks such a big vehicle. And that drivetrain has tremendous problems that come with it. Lots of mechanical failures, breakdowns, hard work to get at the actual engines and the electric motors to help try and repair them. And the other thing Porsche comes up with, he comes up with a longitudinal torsion bar suspension system. And that suspension system, in other words, instead of the torsion bars running across the vehicle from side to side with their twisting that helps give a spring down, these bars are in pairs with pairs of wheels on the side. And it would take a brighter man than me to try and explain to you exactly how that type of torsion bar works. But it's complex and it fails a lot. That's one of the problems. The upside, if you take out the suspension system from being inside the hull, it means you've got slightly more room inside there. By bolting it on the outside, gives you more volume space inside for ammunition, engines, crew, etc. So all of these things together are pushed into production. They're made at something called the Nibelungenwerk outside in Austria. And the vehicles are completed in about May of '43. The last ones actually come off the production line. They make 90 of them all. They convert a few of the original hulls into what becomes recovery tanks without the casement on the rear there, just a front cab there so that they can drag the vehicles off the battlefield. And these vehicles are pushed out very quickly out to the Eastern Front to take part in the Battle of Kursk. Now, we know much is written about the Battle of Kursk, speculated the biggest tank battle of all time. But in the last few years, people have revised that view. Probably there was bigger tank battles earlier in 1941 when Germany first invades Russia. But Kursk goes down in history as a stunning, the last big major German attack on the Eastern Front. And it's first thought of as early as April '43, the planning begins. But it doesn't actually kick off till July. And by that time, the Russians have had plenty of warning about where this attack is coming. Now the Germans delay because sometimes it's about the weather, sometimes it's about equipment, things like these new Panzerjäger tanks coming, and of course the famous Panther. They're waiting till these tanks can actually get to the front line to hopefully make an impact on the battle. But the Russians, the Soviet Red Army, has built massively deep defensives, and when those initial attacks goes in July, the Russians absorb them. They have a very, very clever defensive system of minefields, barbed wire, anti-tank guns. And what happens, and it's in Guderian, he actually writes up an after-action report where he describes how the Ferdinands are being used. What quite often happens is they are being used to go ahead of the infantry as a kind of armoured wedge, burst their way through, and they find themselves isolated because they're not always working with Panzer Grenadiers, guys with other track vehicles to keep up with them. If they're waiting for the traditional infantry, they suddenly find themselves in the middle of the battlefield, this very deep defensive system, and they suffer from things like artillery attacks, and also as well the fact they don't have a close defense weapon, in other words a machine gun in something like a ball mount, just like other Sturmgeschützes. The Sturmgeschütz, the Panzer III version, doesn't have a close defense weapon either. So they followed that trait. And that meant they were vulnerable sometimes for Russian anti-tank teams trying to work around the sides and actually crawl up to try and demolish the vehicle or break a track or to get what would be called a mobility kill. Now, at the end of the battle, Guderian writes he thinks actually about 19 of the 90 vehicles deployed are actually knocked out. And what you find then between the end of July right the way through to Christmas of 1943 is consistently the two main units, Panzerjäger battalions, that's 653 and 654, they are both consistently writing back to headquarters saying we need time to do some serious work on our vehicles. But consistently, because this now is the period the German army is starting to go into retreat, vehicles are being formed into small battle groups, rushed to plug holes in the front line or to lead small counterattacks all the time. So again, this sense of being able to actually work on the problems of the vehicles is always constantly being put off. They never seem to have enough time to do that. The factories are sending out kits out to the front line, trying to help remedy some of these problems, but by the end of the year, it's decided that remaining tanks are to be brought back to the Nibelungenwerk to have a rebuild program. So those tanks actually come all the way back to Austria. They go through a rebuild program in December and January of 1944. And then, of course, we've got the problem, or the Germans have the problems, that there's the landings in Italy. And the landings at Anzio mean that the 653 is actually rushed down to try and stem these landings. They've only got 11 of the 14 tanks they were expecting are ready. So those go down to try and stem the Anzio landings, and that's where this particular tank is captured. Again, most of those vehicles break down at different points, are trying to be recovered. Few are knocked out by enemy action. And it looks like this vehicle was actually abandoned and booby-trapped while it's sitting in a depot behind the beachhead. So it's sitting there actually waiting for this repairs or recovery when the Allies actually advance. And this particular tank is then taken back to Aberdeen Proving Ground in America and evaluated. And we're very lucky the Americans have loaned it to us here for our Tiger display that's on at the moment. So in a way, that's symptomatic what happens to the remaining elephants as they were then called after the rebuild. Pretty much after the rebuild, most of the German records still refer to them as Ferdinands, but this idea of a name change comes pretty much later in 44, and it starts creeping into some of the documentation, but not that much. But those vehicles that remained, they have terrible supply problems, they are moved from pillar to post, and in the end only 2 of them actually make it out of Italy.